Always a pleasure to welcome Arpon Basu to the program, senior columnist with The Athletic, covering the Montreal Canadiens. And when you look at this little hot streak that the Habs have put together, I know Jakub Dobis is getting a lot of the headlines, but there's got to be more than goaltending going right here, right? Like what's fueling this run for the Habs?
It's just like a general way to play. It's an identity that I think they've formed. There's been some serious dips over the course of the season in terms of like specific areas of their game, but it all seems to have kind of come together. And it's not just like, yes, they are on a pretty good hot streak right now, but you look at them since November 11th. Like they lost a game 4-1 in Toronto on Hockey Night in Canada and looked pretty distraught. Marty St. Louis coming out and seeming like a guy who didn't have answers. It was kind of like the nadir of his coaching tenure here in Montreal, like a far cry from the guy who came out on stage at the draft to a standing ovation in Montreal. A lot of questions about him, his defensive system, his ability to coach, frankly. He did come from Pee Wee hockey straight to the NHL, so a lot of people had doubts about that, and I think those started creeping up around that time. 2 days later, on the afternoon of Hall of Fame induction weekend, the Canadiens beat the Sabres in Buffalo 7-5, a super sloppy, like just not a professional hockey game by any stretch, but they won that game. Since then, and we're talking like a 24 game sample, I think, if I'm not mistaken. 24 games. They're playing 604 hockey since then. And that's a big stretch. That's more than a quarter of a season. So, yes, there's been some blowout losses in that span, and there's been some learning to do, but you can't just wipe away a 24 game sample. And of late, I think it's really come together for them. And you mentioned that killer road trip for the Senators while the World Juniors are going on. The Canadiens do that pretty much every year. Their building is booked between just before Christmas and just after New Year's. They're on the road every year, and that road trip is always a killer. This year they they played in Columbus before Christmas, came back for Christmas, then they went Florida, Tampa, Vegas, Chicago, Denver. Two of those games were back-to-back, including the Chicago-Denver game. They come out of that losing only to the Blackhawks, funnily enough. They beat the four last Stanley Cup champions on their home ice. So pretty statement type of trip for them. There's going to be other dips with this team, but it's not any one thing that's driving it. Like their bottom six has been phenomenal. It's not their superstar guys. It's not outrageous goaltending. They've had good goaltending, but it hasn't been superlative. And you didn't get the sense in any of those games really that they goalied the other team. So pretty promising for the future. I would fall short on saying that this means that they're a playoff team or whatever, but they have played themselves into the mix, which was literally the corporate messaging the Canadiens sent out before the season started.
Yeah, you're right. That was the whole goal for this season, was just to be playing meaningful games in March. So Are you a believer with the strides that you've seen, given that the sample size has been pretty big? Will this team be in the mix?
Yeah, there's a couple of things here. The Canadiens have been ridiculously healthy, especially compared to past seasons. They've had horrible injury luck ever since this administration came in. This year, that has not been the case, other than Patrick Laine going down in the preseason, and that's another kind of departure point you can go from. On December 7th, he came back. The power play instantly becomes lethal. But so injuries are going to happen. Things are going to happen. Guys are going to hit slumps. Juraj Slafkovsky is still not playing at the level we saw him at last season. Kirby Dach's just coming out of a season-long funk. Like, that's kind of, in some ways, a cautionary tale in terms of the Canadiens, but in other ways, an encouraging sign. Like, they've done this with some of the key sort of preseason remaining question marks. So can they be in the mix? Yeah, I think they could stay in the playoff mix. And let's be honest, the Eastern Conference is making it easy to be in the mix. Like, there's not a lot of people pulling away from the pack here. So, but they don't need to play at a ridiculous level to remain in the mix if the rest of the conference remains this way. But the actual way that they're playing, the identity that they've formed, I think is repeatable and sustainable with the personnel that they have. So, yeah, I think they could stay in there, and it's going to create a bit of a dilemma come trade deadline if they do that.
It's funny because it doesn't create a dilemma for me, because I think the plan is the plan, right? Like, and you've got to stick to it, and whatever that means, whether it's potentially saying goodbye to Mike Matheson. David Savard should be a non-starter. If someone's calling you to take him, you're trading him. But
it depends on the return, Frank. Honestly, like, I mean, you look at Montreal's war chest of picks, war chest of prospects. If you're getting a 4th round pick for David Savard and it sends a message to the room that we're waving the right flag, there is some value to telling your room that, hey,
yeah,
you've
a 4th
earned
round pick, I
the
would
right.
agree. Yeah, that's different. But like, if someone's giving you something that you feel is actual value, then yeah, I mean, David Savard, you have to.
And the Alex Carrier trade makes that much easier to do, right?
Right, and I think also in that exact moment in time helped prop up this team that they probably needed that support piece at that exact moment in time. It's not all that different than the trade that the Utah Hockey Club made for Oli Mata. It wasn't a huge headline generator, but it in the day-to-day, game-to-game, it really helps what you're trying to accomplish. So my question would be, thinking 30,000 foot view, which you're so good at, is the temperature, has it cooled significantly? Because had this team been far out of the mix, had the heat continued to be turned up on Marty St. Louis as coach, all of a sudden we'd be coming out of the season asking entirely different questions. A market that has remained incredibly patient through this rebuild process, we have been talking about a different story had things continued to go sideways.
Well, let's be honest. Like, I mean, I was talking about it for weeks. Like, the Canadiens need to bank points ahead of this trip because it looked treacherous, right? I mean, can you reasonably expect this team to come out of the trip I just mentioned with 8 out of 10 points? And the only 2 points you lost were in Chicago, for crying out loud. I mean, it's really not logical, but the predictable outcome of that trip would have meant that they would have come back into a hornet's nest for sure. I mean, the heat was getting cranked up. And so what this has done, it's created belief, or I guess rekindled belief in the market, because I think there was some doubt creeping into the Canadiens' overall plan, how they were going to get to a competitive level. It's interesting that coincidentally over the course of this stretch, Ivan Demidov has caught fire in Russia as like probably the most dangerous forward on his team right now, whereas he was getting 5-6 minutes a game for the bulk of the season. Now he's lighting it up. I think he's on a 6 or 7 game goal scoring streak right now and playing 15 to 18 minutes a night.
And Canadiens management was unfairly torched for going to visit him.
Yes, that became a political hot potato. Well, I mean, I guess there's, from an outside perspective, I suppose you could make the argument that you shouldn't be sort of, because there was a lot of propaganda. Like, Scott took that visit and used it. I mean, there's like a 28-minute video on YouTube from Scott St. Petersburg describing that visit as some sort of endorsement of their program. That is not probably what Canadiens management signed up for, but they wanted to. It was important to them to go over there and see him, make sure he was okay, and tell him, reinforce how much of a part of their plan he is. And he just took off from that point onward. So I guess mission accomplished. But to answer your question, yeah, there's definitely a different view of that. Like, the Canadiens left for this trip with a lot of people wondering if this season was just going to be a waste, and now there's a definite sense going into tonight's game against Vancouver, which is a team that's obviously reeling a little bit right now, that they're almost in a better place than their opponent tonight. I mean, obviously the first game back after a long road trip, everyone knows about the pitfalls of that. They might wind up losing this game. But I think the general direction of the Canadiens, the belief in the market has grown significantly because no one could have expected them to come out of this road trip the way they did.
It's been quite the run in Montreal, Arpon. Always appreciate your time and the insight. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
What's up, hockey fans? If you enjoyed that video, then you need to be hitting the subscribe button right here at Daily Faceoff. Exclusive interviews and analysis from our hockey insider Frank Seravalli, fantasy updates from Brock Sagan, and a daily live show at noon Eastern, Monday through Friday. You don't want to miss any of the fantastic content, so hit that subscribe button.